Welcome to Fire and Water, Coming of Age in this Age with Quanita Robertson and Tenneson Wolf, cultivating wise leaders, one show at a time. This is Tenneson and Quanita's conversation on grief, part 2. The question that came up in my mind when you were speaking is this question of, can I be me here?
Yeah.
Because I think that's so connected with grief, because I think we walk around with so much grief. Maybe constantly because of the need to tend to the garden.
Right.
And I often will joke that my job is to travel the planet and make people cry. And I think part of that is that people know. I think we're smarter than we often give ourselves credit for. And we know the spaces where we can do that.
Yeah.
And so what I find is, because I'm a person that holds space like that for people often, then people find me. I'll travel and I'll meet somebody and I've just met them. And there was one time where I was at the Greyhound bus station standing in line, and this woman in front of me starts telling me about her daughter who just died of cancer, and just is, it finds me everywhere. And I think because we are looking for that space and looking for those places where we can feel it and release it and let it go, and somebody can bear witness and hold space for us. Another thing that came to mind when you were speaking is there was a death in my family years ago. I remember the night it happened, someone had taken their own life. And the night that it happened, it was a question for me about whether or not I was going to go to be with family that night. And what I decided is that I needed to go, and mostly because during those moments of death, I think we allow ourselves space to grieve. And what I found is oftentimes more than the grief of that moment comes through. For me, the answer was yes, because I felt like I get more access to truth and feelings and presence in my family in those moments of grief than maybe I do every day. And so I needed to be there. I needed to witness them.
That is, in the words that I'm hearing you speak, that is more than the grief of the moment. There's something more, almost like there's a dammed pool, a dammed bit of the river behind there.
Exactly.
That starts to come through.
Yeah.
Of, hey, we're softened by our grief, or by the experience, or maybe even the experience of being together in that.
Yeah. And I think those moments, you were talking earlier about having permission. Yeah. I think in those moments we feel permission.
Yeah, right.
And so then it opens up a doorway for more of the grief that's stored in us to be released and to come out.
More than the meal that you thought you were ordering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And I would say my relationship definitely has changed from year to year around grief. I see grief very differently now than I did when I was younger.
Yeah.
And some of that is the learning about the difference between sadness, grief, suffering, all of that. Learning the need to empty out.
Yeah.
Before there's room for more to come in, and that grief doesn't come by itself. Like, I get really, in my coaching clients know that, like, they'll start crying and sometimes I'll start smiling. And I start smiling because I know that the grief doesn't come by itself. Like, they're getting more access to joy because it comes together. And so I just get really excited for them, because it's like, for me, it's like, oh, they found another key, and it's really quite sweet to me, actually.
Yeah, you're really highlighting something that's been present for me, especially today, knowing that you and I would be speaking and sharing and thinking out loud together in this context, that we live in a lot of avoidance of grief. I almost feel ingenuine saying that. I definitely live in an amount of avoidance, and I know I'm not alone with that. it was another piece that really caught my attention from the Francis Weller book, which is around he names it the two sins of Western civilization, two primary sins, one being amnesia, forgetting, and the other being anesthesia, meaning going numb. And it does feel to me like there's a whole lot of noise and there's a whole lot of cultural pattern that almost shames us for our grief. Like, well, I'm almost afraid to say that out loud, actually, but to some extent, then there's a way in which we're just like taught to stuff that down. If I link it back to something you said earlier, suck it up and man up, or I don't think that's restricted to just men also, but something about the value of get your stuff together, get yourself together, and never being able to come anywhere close to being less than that or falling apart. It sounds weird to say all of that because, of course, all of us live in a less than perfect version of ourselves. But even that language, the thought that not having your stuff together is less than perfect and perfect is the ideal. Whoa, wait a minute. Perhaps we should stop and just re-examine that a little bit. Grief as a way to, if I try to bring it back to what you were just saying, as a way to get to some of the other stuff that comes with it, that just feels so like real and human with one another, and maybe challenges the value of, well, try to block all of that stuff out. Are you kidding me? I think that's what I hear you pointing to.
Well, because I think that we tend to put value on emotions, and being human is all of it. It's being able to feel all of it, but we put value. We say these are good emotions and these are bad emotions, but the emotions don't care. Either you have access or you don't. Yeah. And so I think of the growth of our access to emotions as the shape of a sphere. Mm-hmm. And so where we tend to block the growth of that sphere is the emotions that we think are bad emotions.
Yeah, right.
But if we're willing to go deeper into those, we get more access to all of them. And so the joy, the happiness, the whatever it is that we consider good emotions, we get more access by being willing to feel the ones we view as bad emotions, because that's where we block it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's a matter of how much access do you have for your emotions, not necessarily how much access do you just have for grief or just have for joy or just have for whatever. They all come together.
Yeah, with like an awareness and acceptance. Oh yeah, that's what this is today.
Yes. Yeah. But because we've deemed grief as being bad, we block, that's where we block our emotions. That's where we dam up.
So Quanita, are there other questions you're asking yourself these days in relation to grief, and other insights that you're finding these days in relation to grief?
I think for me and grief, one of the questions that I always have for myself, because I tend to walk with a lot of people through grief, is how do I keep myself open to access? Number one.
Yeah.
Because it is sad, I tend to want to avoid it too. And how do I keep remembering, I guess is the word. How do I keep remembering the necessity of it?
Yeah, right.
How do I keep remembering the sweetness of it, and that it is part of what it means to be alive? You spoke about the numbing. It's so many of us, when we're walking around numb, we're not living. And so how do I keep access to life and what it really means to be alive? Do you have something that you're noticing or learning or wanting to question more around grief?
I don't know if it's anything different than what we've said so far, but I can feel the stirring within me of some more layers, like the layer of avoiding things. Um, hmm. Yeah, it feels like it's a bigger story here, but something about the kind of storyline that we've created in much of Western society around Western society. I don't know if that's even accurate. It might be North America,
Mm-hmm.
but we've created a story around sort of an unending progress and a trail populated by one success after another. And it's sort of missing the messiness of things, or the widely shared messiness of experience that we have if we're human. So it's funny how that's interesting. Like grief, some criteria for grief can be enculturated into us. In other words, you're not living the norm, too bad. And of course, there can be sadness and grief around that. I notice as I say that, there's a part of me that just says, whoa, but wait a minute. Who said that story was true? So the story that welcomes an inherent messiness, and yes, sadness and grief. Like, even though our grieving, we human beings, we may grieve in different ways, and we may grieve about different things, but we can definitely have the shared experience of what all of that is. And just underneath that, it feels like, can we meet each other in those vulnerable places? Like, I'm kind of getting excited about the idea and everything, but yet I also realize there's moments, I have them in my own life of, I can't even go there. The emotion and the resistance to the emotion is just too much right now.
I think we tend to think of grief as destination and not as process.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, get over it already. When am I going to finish grieving this? Instead of it's a process, it's a journey, that the grief that we go on a subject around grief, and that, we feel different parts of it at different times. I think about my children, and their grandmothers both died when my children are younger. And as my children grow up, I see them experiencing that grief of the loss of grandmother in different ways, because they're different in those different levels. And I think that we tend to have that, at least I've seen that in my life, where I have a different relationship with grief depending on where I am. My mother dying. It doesn't, there's not a point, I don't guess, in my life will all have hit the destination of being done with grieving for my mother dying.
Right. Yeah.
That journey is part of my relationship with my mother now. And the other thing I was wondering about, and that just kind of came up in this conversation for me, is how fear shows up in my life around unfelt grief. And I don't mean fear of the grief. I mean fear of whatever that thing is that I've attached to the grief.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's a loss of something that then I avoid because I haven't done the grieving over the loss of that thing, and the connection between fear, especially because one of the things I've been sitting with is this question around, what if fear isn't a warning but an invitation?
Nice.
And so, like, maybe sometimes fear shows up as an invitation to go deeper into our grief.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I just connect to it in a broader mystery kind of way. I'm very oriented to the mystery, as in there's more unknown than known. There's more unseen than seen. These are things that you and I have shared before. But I'm very oriented to the mystery. So the mystery of what it means to be an individual, including our relationship to grief, to the practice of grieving, to the process of grieving, to the ongoing tending of the garden kind of stuff, to the willingness to even look at the garden. That has, of course, inherent mystery / unknowns in it. When I think at the layer of families or groups or teams or communities, there remains a giant mystery in all of that. And being able to be, this feels connected to me, be in relationship with the mystery is required to also be in the relationship with grief and what it is. I don't know what it all means, but it seems like something is important here to be able to follow it.